Well, thank you to the Young Dex Brass Band who opened tonight, and who are also members of the St. Augustine Band, which welcomed Helen to a music tradition and community here in New Orleans during her stay. I am so happy to welcome all of you here tonight for this conversation with artist Helen Cammock, our first artist in the Amistad-Rivers Research Residency. Together, Amistad Research Center and Rivers Institute for Contemporary Art and Thought realize an international residency program, welcoming contemporary artists into Amistad's extraordinary archive, into research across the city, in the development of ambitious projects that will take the shape of publications, exhibitions, and time-based art. My name is Andrea Anderson, and I serve as the founding director and chief curator for Rivers Institute for Contemporary Art and Thought. I am joined here by my colleagues, Rivers curator Jordan Amrokani and Rivers Amistad residency curator Jade Flint, and together in conversation with Helen Cammock. We hope that something of this sort of round table or chair circle, part circle, will communicate something of the collaborative nature of our program, which draws support from and knowledge about the city and region, archival history, and Helen's practice from so many colleagues. Not on this stage are a number of people who have made this experience possible. Dr. Carol Olich, the executive director of Amistad, rarely takes the stage because she is ever doing other work. Chris Harder, Philip Cunningham, and Lisa Moore have worked closely with Helen throughout her stay in the archive. And none of this partnered effort would be possible without the support of our residency program by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the support from the Rosa Marie Foundation, which affords Helen research to take shape as publication and exhibition. With this bit of context about our work together, I welcome you, Helen, to give a bit of context about the work that brings you here.
Okay. I kind of imagined that probably people would not necessarily, I would never assume they would have seen my work before. So I'm going to just do a kind of introduction to the kind of work that I make, the kind of mediums that I use, and then we're going to have a conversation about my time here in a bit more focus, yeah? A bit more detail. So I have a multidisciplinary practice, which for me began out of a photography degree. By the time I guess I had got to my kind of final year of undergraduate, I realized that a still image wasn't enough, and I'd started to use text, I'd started to write, so I'd tried to make books and I tried to make projects in which I had still images and text. And by the time I was there, I started to become itchy for moving image. So I now work across film, which is probably, I would say, the kind of core, but also the foundation of most of my projects. But I also work in performance. I write poetry. So I do quite a lot of spoken word work. I work with printmaking, so screen prints, lino cuts. And there's something about, I suppose, the seepage across all the different mediums that pulls all the themes and ideas for me together. I'm interested in storytelling. So often the stories that happen in each of my projects are multiple. So many people's stories alongside or intersecting with each other. But something about this idea of a fragmented story is at the core. The stories that they unfold or evolve across this film or the prints or the performance. So this idea of seepage is really important to me. For me, histories are important, but so too are geographies and their intersects. I believe history is to be cyclical, never to be linear. I kind of don't believe in the idea of linear history. So this idea that conversations, moments, situations, conflicts, misunderstandings, understandings are something that come round again and again and again. So this idea of the cycle is really important in the work that I make. And then the idea of geographies being rhizomatic, the idea of tendrils and subroots and connections being made, and then the intersect between history and geography. So this idea of almost jumping between time and place. So that's either in the now or jumping back historically, but moving across different sites and different spaces. And that's what history means to me. Most of my projects subscribe to the notion that they're able to cross this time and place in order to engage in dialogue. So that's kind of my root aim or my root intent, is this idea of conversation, this idea that if we don't talk, we don't move things around, we don't understand things, we don't understand the slippage, we don't understand where we've come from. So dialogue is the most important thing for me. And the idea of voice and voices in their, I guess, their broadest sense are how that happens. So I'm interested in the idea that voices have been extinguished, omitted, silenced, misrepresented. And then I'm also interested in who's been uplifted and amplified. I'm interested in the how and the why of that. And I'm also interested in who benefits from that and who is damaged by that. So this idea of the voice for me is very much, it plays out in a lot of the films that I make through this idea of the multiple voice. What it means for different voices to come together alongside each other, and often that's without intent or knowledge. So it's by my orchestration. So for example, I might take a piece of text from a poem, or I might take the lyrics from a song, I might take a section from a philosophical text, and I might mix those all together, somehow weaving a conversation or a story that then uses my words as well. So this idea of an orchestration and me almost as a kind of way of I can't say the word now. What's the word of? It's not coming. Like a
Ventriloquism.
Thank you. That's the word. It just wouldn't come out.
Group work.
Yeah. So there's something about it coming out of my mouth, which changes the
We
meaning.
never planned that.
Yeah, which changes the meaning. So this idea that if I speak some words, it will not have the same meaning as you speaking the same words, because of who I am and because of you are who you are. And that's what's really interesting to me, this idea of subject position. And I call this my audible fingerprint, which I believe we all have. Everyone has it. In my hearing and in my understanding of human nature, we all have an audible fingerprint, because whenever we speak, we say something which is utterly individual to us, tied together with all our experiences, whether they're our personal experiences, but they're also the political, social experiences who are us, who make up who we are individually. And it's about being aware of those and understanding those, in which we then, I hope, can start to understand and unpick the things that we are told are historical fact, historical knowledge, even through literature. So I'm also interested in the idea of the different registers of the voice. So this is about the sung voice, the whispered voice, the shouted voice, and the played voice, like what we just heard this evening. I think of that as voice. They have their own sound and their own meaning, and we listen to them, we receive them, we are able to articulate in a different way when we do use different registers of the voice. We walk around in the world doing it every single day. We understand succinctly how to use different registers of our own voices. And so there's something about I'm interested in highlighting that, I suppose, and seeing it as a way to change different conversations. So I've come to New Orleans to explore some of these things: histories, geographies, voices, power dynamics, what it means to use your own voice as an artist, as a musician, as a writer, editor, archivist, and activist. And yeah, that's kind of what I want to say about my practice. And then maybe we're going to have a conversation about what
we're
that's
going to
meant
invite you
being
to say
here.
much more. The way that I think we've structured this evening is we'll be showing clips from Helen's, from films that Helen has previously realized. So we'll open first with a segment now.
There's a safe beauty to a library, a quiet containment of lies, myth, and substantive construct. I sit with these thoughts, wanting to read, but also wanting to question. I need to know, but fear what I won't be told. Page upon page in locked cabinets, the history of everything, something, nothing. It is a tangible archive of belief and pedagogy. So why do I sit, knowing that I won't discover it all here? And yet here I sit, with my pencil, tablecloth taught, and research. What is here is a history woven, intricate as silk, crude as fishing net, confusing as tunnelled cobweb, and tight as wound cotton. I know there is safety here, also brutality, acceptance yet challenge, because not only are cultural and geographical contexts different, so are our internal contexts. Stories unravelling, shifting my own understanding of histories, its lies, its myths, its omissions, and its mistakes. These are never safe. Their action is unsafe, and the outcomes of their action also unsafe. Here I sit then, in a labyrinth of something quiet and uncompromisingly dangerous. After centuries of dominance, the fortunes of the sugar industry have become so clouded by uncertainty that many observers doubt that it will survive for much longer. I said, after centuries of dominance, the fortunes of the sugar industry have become so clouded by uncertainty that many observers doubt that it will survive for much longer. Yes, after centuries of dominance, the fortunes of the sugar industry have become so clouded by uncertainty that many observers doubt that it will survive for much longer.
Well, thank you so much for your introduction, Andrea, and thank you so much for being here with us, Helen. So in advance of your first day in New Orleans in January, we prepared at the Amistad Research Center, and we were pulling some materials from Elizabeth Catlett's papers from the civil rights history in New Orleans and the Mardi Gras Black Maskers. So I'm curious to see how these materials served as a starting point for you, and how and why these touchstones were touchstones for you, but also where they pointed elsewhere.
Okay, so I think my beginning, when I first started to look into the archive, both the archive and the art collection, I know it's as one, but in my mind, coming to it as an artist and having to search in different spaces for the material, I think I landed upon particularly Elizabeth Catlett because I was completely taken by a series of prints that I felt like I recognized faces. This idea that you can recognize something. I remember doing it as a child. I'd sit looking through old black and white photographs of people that I completely didn't know. But then I would look and I would try and recognize and see that person as though they were walking down the street or they were in my class at school. And so there was this idea, even as a child, I think, of being or wanting the will to connect to people who were outside of my experience, not just in terms of the geography, as I said before, but historically. And so there was something about these prints that drew me towards Elizabeth Catlett. And then the prints were all laid out and ready, and I was completely kind of blown away. And then the boxes came. So the boxes and boxes of materials, and they contained letters, they contained photographs of Elizabeth Catlett at work, particularly on the Louis Armstrong statue. That completely grabbed me. And then I read all the letters of what it meant for her to be working as a quite impoverished artist, living in Mexico at the time, having moved from here, but being invited to make this statue that was part of a kind of an honorific statue that was a kind of a tribute to somebody who was really significant and important to New Orleans. And yet the letters were all about trying to control how she made the work, whether she got the face right, whether she should have the shirt open, because that might say one thing compared to another thing, whether Armstrong should be moving or whether he should be static, what that would say about him and what it would say about the city. And before I knew it, I was in this world that reminded me absolutely of the world that I inhabit as an artist, where you're invited, particularly with public commissions, to make a work. But then every partner who's involved wants to somehow control that. There's almost like a lack of trust in the artist to translate and transform the idea or the notion of what's happening. And so I was completely drawn into this. And then I found that Catlett had made artworks as part of the civil rights movement. And then there were letters about how there were secret postings of initial drawings, initial ideas for pamphlets and posters. And, particularly, I guess there were some moments that were particularly dangerous, I guess. And then that led me into this idea of the artist coming alongside and being part of and being enmeshed in civil rights. So the artist as activist. And that opened up then. You were with me, Jade. So unfortunately for Jade, I was going, and then there's this, and maybe we could look at this, and then there's this, and maybe we can look at that. And that's what happened. And that's the beauty of working with an archive for me, is that you are led by the people in that archive or the moments in history in that archive. And inevitably, one human will lead you to another, and then that will lead you to another group or another political moment or another philosophical moment, or it will lead you to music or a kind of cultural happening. So yes, we wound our way, and I wound my way with you, helping me through the archive in a way that was completely unexpected. I'm not actually sure if that's an answer, but
It's a great answer.
yeah, okay.
It's a great answer.
Can you hear Lucretia calling from the convent? Can you hear her rage? Can you hear the sound of her defiance? Can you hear the name? The name, the name, the name of resistance, the name of something here. Can you hear the battle from the convent? For the sound of the trumpet clear, the sound of the trumpet clear, the sound of the trumpet clear. Can you hear Lucretia calling from the convent? Can you hear her rage? Can you hear the sound of her defiance? Can you hear the name? The name, the name, the name of resistance, the name of something here. Can you hear the battle from the convent? For the sound of the trumpet clear, the sound of the trumpet clear, the sound of the trumpet clear.
Trumpets, concerts, jealousy from monks, disapproval from the pious, joy from the people, conspiracy, whispers, papal troops, refusal to surrender, trumpets sound from female lips, stones rain down, speech and tears, roaring crowds of support, Lucretia speaks, stones pass from child to adult, adult to child, but papal troops are strong, the nuns starved to surrender. Lucretia stops, writing, singing, playing, some say living, as her mind faded into the walls of control.
So this clip is from your 2019 film, Chorus Che si può fare, the result of your residency organized by Max Mara, Whitechapel Gallery, and Collezione Maramotti. We've been practicing. Upon your receipt of the Max Mara Prize for Women. This film weaves together stories of women's loss and resilience, voices from Bologna, Florence, Venice, Rome, Palermo, Reggio Emilia, many voices rarely heard, rarely filmed, rarely figured in the foreground. This film takes its title from a 1663 pre-opera by Italian composer Barbara Strozzi. You took classical singing lessons to learn this aria, which figures in video work and as a live performance, and twice you performed the piece with a jazz trumpeter. Here in New Orleans, you've also taken music lessons, trumpet. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about how music figures in your practice in Che si può fare, but also about music lessons, and I think perhaps more than even the ultimate performance, and how that operates as a kind of research.
Well, I suppose that the idea of the voice and the idea of the essence of the voice within the body is something about embodiment. So for me, it's about sighting myself in whatever space I find myself in. And there's something about music that enables me to feel, touch, understand a space that I'm in. So depending on what I'm learning, I'm learning it for a reason. So the project in Italy was about this idea of the space that women have inhabited in terms of their sense of loss and lament, but also the strength and resilience in that and the resistance in that. And music has played a really important part in many, many cultures, and often the space for women to play is limited or curtailed in many ways on the face of it. So historically, often in the kind of dominant historical narratives that we understand. But actually, when you start to be around people who understand the histories of music or who play music, of course, you realize this is not the case. And so there's something about music as being a site for excavation. So that feels like this way of kind of digging away, but actually it's a kind of fluid way of digging away, because you start to ask questions, you start to be around people where music is part of who they are, you start to learn and understand. And then there's the other part of it. When you sing, something comes from inside you and you learn something which is outside of your experience potentially. So for me, my goodness, it was the hardest thing I have ever done to try and have classical singing lessons and to learn this pre-opera lament. But I did it. And I did it in the way that I needed to do it, which was not to sound like an opera singer. It was to sound like Helen Cammock, thinking about what it means to say these words in a language that I don't understand, but to a piece of music that I connect to on a level that I could never have imagined. I almost knew what that piece of music was about before I learnt it. So I started learning it for, I don't know how many weeks, maybe 5 lessons before I sat down with my very strict Italian singing teacher from the conservatoire, who was just kind of beside herself that I think she thought it would never happen and I would never be able to do anything with this. And she said, do you actually know what the words mean? So then I said to her what I thought they meant. I said, I haven't looked them up, but I said, I feel like I can just feel it. She was like, oh. And then I said, what I think it's about. And she was like, yeah, you're right. Yeah. That is exactly what this piece of music is about. And it's quite melodramatic. And I said, I thought it felt a bit melodramatic. And that's I was slightly struggling with that, because in terms of singing a classical piece, it was really hard. It was really, really hard. And And then I thought, okay, I have to somehow own this music because I feel it in a way that I would feel perhaps listening to Miles Davis. It got into me and I felt it. And so I invited a really interesting young jazz trumpeter to come and sit with me. We talked about the song. She listened to it. I tried to sing it to her. She got it as well straight away. And so we constructed this duet between us, and we recorded it. So we have a vinyl of it. And actually I think it's a really interesting, piece of music. But there's something about me understanding why I was doing it. It was about citing myself. It was trying to have a connection again across history with somebody that I don't know, I would never have met, of course, and a kind of genre of music that I didn't know before being offered this residency. So something as well is about the leap of faith that you take when you visit a new place. So it's about the place, it's about the people, it's about the sounds, the smells, the feeling of being somewhere. And music can do that for me. There's something, we were talking earlier about this idea of the vibration of sound, the vibration of work and what that means. And so the trumpet lessons here, I'm not expecting to leave in 5 days as a great trumpeter. I'm not expecting that. What I would like is to have now developed a relationship with a trumpet teacher who is incredibly nurturing and understands this idea of voice and breath, and who I'm going to continue having lessons with on Zoom. And so this new relationship has developed. I've bought myself a new second-hand trumpet while I was here that I'm taking with me as a way of feeling it as I go. So it's almost like journeying, I suppose, rather than tourism, I hope. This idea that I'm not just coming to look at the people that do it well. I'm trying to feel actually what they're doing and what they're saying with their doing it well, and then seeing what that means for me.
Yeah. We have people in the audience who can attest that you've improved already.
Oh, yes.
I won't make
Next
them
door
stand up.
neighbours.
They're so very lucky.
Dem put Eva in a bed, Eva could not sleep. Eva, Eva. Dem put Eva in a bed, Eva could not sleep. Eva, Eva. Dem put Eva in a bed, Eva could not sleep. Put her on the floor, Eva sleep like in dream.
And you told me about the ships. And you told me about the tourists. And you told me about the danger. And you told me about the risks.
We are a self-involved people, but in watching this film and watching many of your films, it is really difficult not to see ourselves, our own conditions, conditions of our place, relevance to, not sure what that means, relevance to our experience, our waterways, our ships and tourists, our dangers and risks. And this feels as much a defining part of your practice across the board as anything else, this capacity to sort of identify and tease out rhymes between sites and cross-temporally as well. Excellent. And I wonder about this as, not only because, this week I've been thinking quite a bit about Venice and New Orleans, the relationships that we bear as, throngs of people descend upon the city. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you give shape to these relationships, both visually through language. It seems to be always a tease of the places you've been before in the next place.
Well, I suppose, just there we've seen a kind of landscape which is familiar, which I guess, we can look at the landscape of New Orleans and it's the same thing really, that often, I spent 6 weeks there, which is not a huge amount of time, but it was enough time to have relationships with people who started to talk about this idea of we've become a Disneyland, this idea of the performance of your own city and how damaging that is. And watching it now, having been here, it's not intended. So that's the idea, is that when you make something and you start to understand what you're trying to say about a site and a place and what's happening to it, you kind of understand and know that there are other sites and other places across the globe that will also be experiencing those very same things. They're not exactly the same, but there are some real resonances. We were talking about just Venice, the idea of the damage to the kind of waterways, the damage to the land, the idea that people come to a space because of what's presented about it. So what people imagine about your city, and then people can't afford to live in their own city anymore because of that. So this idea of hyper gentrification, which Venice absolutely has, probably more than here, but still it's very, very, just being here for a short term, I can see it, I can feel it. And so this idea, I suppose, that I believe that we do inhabit different spaces, different sites, at the same time, and so it makes complete sense that there will be stories and experiences that move across from one geographical space to another geographical space, from one site to another. So we were, the kind of the flat song that we heard with the Lucretia calling from the convent was a story that was about a nun who used to write music. So her story ran alongside this, the story of, hang on, I'm getting my names mixed up. So Lucretia was a nun, and she worked in she ran a kind of choir and a music school within a monastery. And she got into a situation where the monks were really jealous, because what happened was that the local community came to listen to the music that the nuns performed every Sunday. It kind of became like a gig. So this idea that something that's born out of a funeral or a church service, but then becomes something that the community take on, becomes something enlivened. And then there are people who don't want that to happen. So there's this rub between celebrating and enjoyment and what should be done, what's appropriate and I believe that happens in many, many communities, but particularly where music is part of that. So there's something about many stories like that can jump around, jump across places, jump across time. And that was a story that was about gender. And the Pope in the end made a ruling saying that no women could put a trumpet to their lips because it was unseemly and sexualized. And so she wasn't allowed to write the music that she had been writing all of that time. And so there became a siege where the nuns were blocked into the monastery, and the community, the whole towns, some of the towns from neighbouring areas came and brought them food, shoved it under the doors, brought them rocks. Children were running rocks up through. And so there was this huge battle between the community and this music, because they had so taken this music inside them, almost more, which was the fear of the Pope, more than the religion, that it touched them so very deeply, and they looked so forward every Sunday or every concert moment, that they didn't want to let go of it. And so it became this struggle and this battle. And I suppose I see those struggles and those battles everywhere. And so there are many battles in that way that I think cross different sites and countries and moments in history. And they interest me because I'm interested in the way that humans attach to sound and attach to each other and attach to stories, and do actually challenge the structures in which the dominant kind of narrative or the dominant structures in which they live. I'm interested in how those challenges happen, and that they can rumble away and vibrate across different communities.
And sometimes it happens in this sort of somewhat subtle echo. Sometimes it's not as subtle, but these kind of echoes of one another that are unintended, as you said. And then there are other places in your work where the ways that one place works on another in a quite political and even activist position plays out. And so we're going to show two clips from your film Movable Bridge, which will function, I think, as a literal and figurative bridge for
I hear curry arrived in the 17th century, and I hear the first black sailors were here long before this. I hear that as a port town, everyone is a migrant from somewhere. I hear the passage of spice from the Orient blew through the streets, from ships to tables, from ships to ships, from port to port, on their way to the Americas. I hear that the churches are aplenty, and this signifies flux in community. I hear that the docks were places where different faces laughed and fought, loved and died. But the past is always shifting. What we know, what becomes our story, and Hull is no different. Pearson Park was built for the people of Hull to have somewhere beautiful to spend their time off, away from the harsh existence, cruel seas, exhausting dock life. Pearson was a man who supported the people he owned, his workforce. A conscious decision to look after those with less, but the decision to support the Confederate States in the American Civil War meant that in protecting the needs of the workforce, Hull contributed to the continued enslavement of the black population in the US. Manchester mills refused to work the cotton from the Americas, while Hull actively supported the machines of plantation life in order to support their own existence. If you aren't seen, you don't see others. I'm interested in this opening up and closing down, in this seeing and unseeing, this hearing and unhearing. Time doesn't seem to matter. There have always been those who are open to the world, community, family, and there are those who block and counterattack. The empire was built on something that broke backs and hearts and lives, everywhere. It was the perpetrator of a dead bod. And Tom Jessup tells the tale of the wounded bird, nurtured by tulip on board, searing summer heat, splintered wings and bed of rags. Flap and sleep, blink and peep. Clumpered by Bob Skelton on point of release. Dead bod. Pongo's yarn, tongue in cheek, or truth he speaks. As of now, with the Seamen's contract to take over most of Alex Dock and the jetty, myself and a few other pilots have taken this to management that the name Deadbod should stay. And we have it from the harbour master that this will be the case and will present it to Seamen's at the appropriate time. Seamen's Deadbod berth sounds good enough to me. Sitting in a gallery, waiting to be returned to the Humber, waiting to be home. A symbol of the docks, the fishing industry, the struggle for contingency, for control, for a stake in life, for safe passage, for home. Now it is the symbol for being heard, for being able to honour the past and control the future. It is the symbol of a class struggle. A struggle between a way of living that was outward-looking because it had much of what it needed on the inside. Now there are blocks that separate. Is there enough on the inside to nourish and sustain? Then Siemens asks you not to vote for Brexit, and you do it anyway. Jobs and hope, future plans, economy, wind farm, European investment. What happened? The docks, the life of the port, has always been contested ground. Lives fractured, fluctuating from one tragedy to another, death at sea. And now people are coming close, running from great pain and from threat of death on sea and on land, and you have closed the doors. You have pulled in again and said the port is closed. We are closed. And I'm trying to make sense of this, because when I walk the streets, I feel cresting, troughing tidal warmth, and I don't understand where the line of welcome, fishing net strength has been severed. I don't understand what has happened. And who asks the questions, and how do we begin to know the stories that we might not know, may not understand? We can't know everything. Some voices are silent, uninvited, and so unknown.
Hi, Helen.
Hi.
I'd like to, in my question, ground down a little bit on this notion of voice, because you've mentioned it a lot, and we've also heard your voice in a number of ways in this talk, in these films, etc. And one of the things that I think about in a lot of your projects is that you take on this notion of voice and this notion of who has a voice, whose voice gets heard, and on what terms. And of course, this is a political question. But I also think that since your work is often on display and presented in either the United Kingdom or a European context, that the way in which voice sort of figures in one way in your work is not, of course, just political, but specifically a national question. Perhaps we could think of voice as the notion of the people, the voice of the people, excuse me, or the voice of a nation. And in this last clip, there is mention of Europe, there is mention of Brexit, there is mention of all of the sort of swirling circularities of how we sort of are thinking about nationalism in this time. And so to pose a question to you, I guess, would be, is there perhaps a way in which you are thinking about voice as in through a nationalist lens, or maybe even like an anti-nationalist lens, that like there's something about the way the voice takes shape in your work that isn't about singularity or unification, but a kind of splitting or expansion of voice in a political way?
I mean, I think absolutely, because I mean, to start with, I guess I don't believe in the idea of a national voice. I think I believe in the idea of a dominant voice, whoever that is. In the UK, it won't be the same as in the US. The class system that we have is so inbuilt, the colonial system that we have, and we acknowledge in a much less open way, I think, than happens in the States. All of these things are brought together to undermine the idea of individual voices or particular communities' voices, or the idea that this voice can be fluid and it needs to be open and it must be active and working all the time. So yes, I guess it is anti-national voice, because I don't believe it can actually happen. All the conversations about democracy, they kind of mean nothing to me, really, in a kind of political sense, when I believe that people are so silenced or so intentionally extinguished, I guess, from conversations, whether those are contemporary conversations or whether it's our understanding of how our society has been built. I think many of the conversations that happen in the UK around race, for example, happen in very particular contexts. And there are many contexts where then they're kind of silenced, though even the conversations about what happens and what has happened. Brexit is a perfect example of this idea of a closing down of we don't want people coming in, and the notion of who can come in and who has always been enabled to come in and who has always been welcomed and who has been held at the door or actively now pushed aside, pushed hundreds of thousands of miles when they try to come to the door, because of who they are, because of the colour of their skin or the country that they have inhabited previously. So this idea of a national voice is not the case. In the UK, it was kind of practically 50-50 for the Brexit vote. And so we now find ourselves in a situation where half of a nation, in fact, now it's many more than half of a nation, are saying, what has happened? How did we get to this point? And the point that we got to through all the same, manipulative processes, albeit political, educational, all of those processes that for us are embedded in a kind of colonial history, in the class system that is also, I would say, a colonial history that we have in the UK. So this idea of the multiple voice is what's really, really important to me. And I think I remember having a conversation I think I was maybe a late teenager and speaking with a teacher who said to me, do you realise that the person who invented the gas mask was black? Do you realise that the fountain pen was invented by an enslaved man? Do you realise that traffic lights were invented by a person of colour? And this list was endless, but they're the lists that we don't know. And so this idea of national understandings are so narrow that I feel like I have an absolute responsibility to be slashing away at them, biting away at them, opening them up. And I will do that in whatever way that I feel works with the moment or the project or the piece of work that I can. And I will use voice because music is language. I will use poetry if I can, because that will speak to other people. I couldn't read for ages, and a desperate mum that I had took me and gave me these Liverpool poets who were working class poets. And that was the way that I learned how to read, because there weren't so many so many words on the page. There was space, and I had space to start understanding and being in touch with these stories that I was hearing. And so I use different strategies because they make sense to me, and I have this sense that they speak about different things to different people. So this idea of different languages.
That spacing is still in your typography, in your page layout.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
It's
true.
Well, no, that was going to be my follow-up question is thinking about the ways that you work across so many platforms, genres in such a multimedia way, every single genre, whether it's drawing or film or photography, enacts a voice differently. And I think that multiplicity that exists in your practice is already doing so much work in relationship to this question of politics for me. Because I'm an art historian, I always think about the sort of traditions and the hierarchies, as we were talking about before this talk, of what painting has meant for the nation across the centuries, and the way in which you are sort of doing so much more outside of those hierarchies and traditions, I think is really powerful, Helen. My second and maybe last question is, I am from I'm from Louisiana. But I have been an extended visitor in the United Kingdom. I lived there for 5.5 years, and I have very often thought about the relationships between those two places, both New Orleans and London, and the ways in which both cities, I think, are oriented in dramatically similar ways. I think about them as two cities who are both interrupted by waterways and rivers, which does something to the way people move through the city, I think, in a way. They're also two cities shaped by generations of persons carrying, moving, transporting, and destroying things in the name of empire, multiple empires sometimes. They're both cities with a strong division, I think, between the rural and the urban, it's London or bust in England. And I feel like in the state of Louisiana, it's almost like a New Orleans or bust situation too, particularly if you work in, the fields that we do. Is this something that you have felt? I'm interested in sort of your thinking now that you've had sort of 2 touchdowns in New Orleans this year. Are you finding resonances in and relationships geographically, landscape-wise, in your time here with what you are most familiar with?
I mean, I think you've probably answered your question
Probably.
yourself, but yeah, because there is something about the histories that people understand in particular places. And I think London is one of those places. It is one of those places that people migrate to, whether that's forced migration or whether it's through choice. There's an idea that people will find a space or a site to be in London. And I think that's very different to anywhere else in the UK. There isn't a fear, I think, if you come from somewhere else, because there's an understanding that many people come from outside, and they have been coming from outside for many, many years, centuries, whether it's through force or through choice. And so there's safety in that. And the rest of the UK, for me, doesn't have that in the same way. So, I guess I'm saying that because I've spent quite a lot of time recently in Europe, and that doesn't feel the same to me. Walking around as a woman of colour, it doesn't feel the same. And I came to New Orleans having had probably, and I apologise for this, but some prejudice about feeling unsafe in the States. How will it be? How will I be? How will I be received? How will I be seen? What will I represent to people in many different ways? Sure. And actually, I have probably said to a few people here that I feel like I've come to a place where I'm both seen and unseen in an incredibly safe way that I have never experienced anywhere else in the world. And I was trying to explain what that means. And I think I have been in particular parts of Northern Europe where you're stared at all the time, you're challenged all the time, you feel a kind of silent aggression happening around you all the time. And this recognition of your difference is incredibly othering. And it's not necessarily that I feel I'm going to be physically attacked or violated in any way, but it's the kind of repercussion of a kind of emotional violence that happens and a sense that you don't belong. And there are many places in the UK where that's also the same, particularly in the countryside. And actually coming to New Orleans, I found myself walking on the street for the first time probably in my life, genuinely not feeling like that. And people would speak to me. They'd look at me when they wouldn't really look at me. And I knew it wasn't a stare. There's something about understanding gaze. When you experience gaze in a kind of negative way, you start to be able to read what a gaze means. And so I feel that I haven't necessarily, sometimes when I open my mouth and I speak, then there's something of that
There's a
happens.
clue.
And that's fine as well, like that's an interest of someone coming from somewhere else. But there's something about the gaze when you haven't even spoken, you haven't even done anything, you haven't even walked into a room, or you're just walking along the street, that the experience in Europe is very, very, very different. And so that's one of the things that I've been surprised by, but actually it's got me thinking even more about this idea of subject position, of what it means, the kind of colonial landscape of, where were we yesterday in the cafe? Christina said.
Saint Roch.
Oh, yeah. Well, you could be from here. If someone just looked at you, you could be from here. And that is something that I have never experienced in my life before, which sounds, the age I am, sounds kind of terrifying, but it's the truth. I've never felt that I could belong somewhere, or I could be seen to be from somewhere, because I'm always being asked where I'm from. Yeah, but where are you really from? And nobody said that to me here, Oh, there's some laughs because it does happen. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if that's answered the question, but
That was beautiful. Thank you.
okay.
Yeah, and I think the last part definitely resonated with a lot of our audience members. And I think your answer kind of points to my last question. So we did spend a lot of times in the archive as part of your research, but also we spent so much time with even individuals in the archive who were very helpful to us, like Philip and Chris and Lisa. So, and we already expressed our thanks to them, but thank you again. Also, just a plethora of people who were generous with their time, like Queen Charisse Harris Nelson, Big Chief Damon Melanson, his wife Alicia, Jonathan, also known as Five Star. And, you know, I just want to close our event by asking you not just what has surprised you about coming here, but also what has it felt like being in New Orleans?
Well, I probably have already kind of half answered that one, but there's something about the openness of not in a kind of superficial way. So the kind of, greeting on the street, which in my very English way we've been laughing about, that I'm kind of, if someone says, how are you doing? And they're, well, actually, I'm really fine and well. And everyone's like, right, it's enough, Helen. They're not really asking you for the whole list of how you are. It's not that friendly. So yeah, some people are. No, I'm laughing, but yeah, sometimes it falls strangely silent. But actually, I feel like I've had a way in that I wasn't expecting to have, a way in that's been incredibly generous and incredibly diverse. So you've mentioned a few people. They're in completely different situations. Five Star, we were in an Uber on the way to a restaurant, and we were just talking in the back, and he turned around and said, right, so who's Helen then? And and so then we struck up a conversation about, why I was here, what I was doing. He started to talk about his own music. And in that moment, I just said, would you like to be in a film? I'm making a film. I'm here. Shall we meet for coffee and have a conversation about your music and what you do and why you do it? And I can talk about what I do and why I do it. And he said, yes. And so there are moments like that where I find my way in, not because somebody is known as a great rapper, but because he raps. And because it's part of his life and who he is, it's a part of his imagination, it's a part of his understanding of who he is, how he sees himself, how he wants to see himself. And of course, before we knew it, we were talking about family, we were talking about hurricanes, we were talking about what it means to struggle, what that struggle might look like or feel like for different people. So these conversations that begin from perhaps a ride in an Uber or an introduction to somebody, or people that I haven't met yet. So I was talking to Lisa in the archive, and there's somebody called Alexis DeVoe who Lisa read me one of the stories, one of the sections from a story that her publishing company had edited. And I found myself having met somebody that actually I hadn't met. And I'm going back to the archive on Saturday to meet somebody else that now, having had a conversation with Lisa, I'm going to meet. My next door neighbour, M.A., talks about Material Institute. I went to visit there before
Saturday night.
Yeah, Showcase Saturday night. So before I knew it, I was hearing about this project that supported young emerging musicians in New Orleans, and from outside, people coming to here to work and record their first kind of professional record. See how old I am. So there are these moments and stories that have come into being. You have introduced me, we would never have gone to St. Aug's to listen to the band if we hadn't had that conversation about how important it has been in your life, in your family, in your community. And I wanted to see and hear what that felt like. And, I didn't want to feel like I was invading. So we went to this huge big band practice, which was the loudest thing I have ever been to in my entire life. It was quite incredible. This was
just before Mardi Gras, so it was
the incredibly talented young men.
First practice back
early
January.
Yeah, it was amazing. So there are these moments, and what I'm trying to say is I have felt somehow welcomed and at home in a place where I'm meeting people that I never would have met before, who would never have met me before, and that is a privilege. And yeah, I guess that's all I want to say, really. It's felt like a privilege.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you. The only problem with everyone having been so generous is that we find the more generous people are, the shorter time has felt. We have this is the second time Helen's been here, because the first time we realized, oh, that's not enough time. We're going to need to invent more time. At the end of every trip, we're like, I think Helen needs to come back.
And then I was saying to Cara the other day, I think it
perpetuity.
doesn't really feel long enough.
Exactly. We do want to open it up for questions, should there be any from the audience. So please don't be shy if you have questions for Helen or for any of the panelists. Yeah.
And thank you so
Please.
much for coming and joining our city. And the song that we appreciate really touched me too. I had no idea what the meaning of the words are, but could you shed a little light on that?
Yeah, so the Lucretia song was I decided that I'd written a bit of text about that story, and I decided that instead of speaking it, I just wanted to sing it, which I do quite often. So if I do a performance, I might have a bit of text that suddenly I might decide that needs to be sung rather than spoken. So it was sung in the style of plain song, which is kind of medieval. I mean, it feels plain. It has a flatness to it. And I think the way that I try to use music and sound is to tell stories in a way that are received differently through the sensation of the music and through the sensation of the sound. So for me, that the plain song sounded sad. There was pain. There's pain in it. And I don't know. I just started singing it. So I can't even tell you how I wrote it. I just started to sing it. And then the more I sang it, the more I realized that I wanted that bit of text to be sung. And then it goes into the text that tries to talk about the story, which is the story of the nun who can't play the trumpet. And actually, she eventually lost her mind, basically. So she stopped writing, she stopped teaching music, and she just went into a room and lost her mind. So it's a sad story, and it was about finding a different way, a different language to somehow convey that. That's not just through me telling the story through spoken words. Thank you.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Welcome.
Firstly, I want to just say thank you for creating this space and sharing your thoughts, representing your ideas and experiences. It's been really inspiring.
Well, thank you.
The question that we have.
The group question.
For the last clip that had music, I believe, well, singing, let me specifically say.
Yes.
It sounded like folk singers, and it sounded a lot like groups that we know from back home. My partner and I are from Jamaica.
It's the Jamaican folk singers.
It's the university folk singers, is it?
The Jamaican folk singers. They've changed who's in it over time because people have passed. So they've been singing since like the late 50s. Yes, it's them. So my dad used to play that to me to go to sleep at night. So, but it's actually a really sad song about an enslaved girl who can't sleep.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there a reason you chose that song for that particular film?
Yes, because there's another section in the film that moves to in the lagoons where there's a mental institution where they used to lock up young girls who got pregnant. And so it kind of connects this idea of what it means to be a young woman and be in fear of your life. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Oh.
And then the heart bit after that is Alice Coltrane. So you wouldn't necessarily know it's Alice Coltrane, but.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Echoing. I guess my question is jumping off of Jordan's in terms of the waterways. I lived in Vauxhall for
Okay.
a year. And I remember, like, when I would go to the Thames, I'd be like, okay, I feel like this is my moment to also embody and think of the Mississippi River in remembering home. And so I guess I'm just wondering, what kind of memory work did you feel between New Orleans' waterways and
Okay. Well, I would say that sometimes I find rivers, or rivers that run through cities, they have a real sadness for me, and the Thames does have that. It feels like a Victorian river, and all that embodies. And I spend a lot of my time in Brighton by the sea. And yesterday we went to Lincoln Beach, and there was something for me about the kind of the idea of a beach, of a coastal, that expanse rather than a narrowing of a canal or a riverway. That's kind of the kind of riverway that is for a port or for a city. That really spoke to me yesterday. It made me feel like being at home, and it made me feel connected, because for me seas are, I know it's the lake, but there's a connection to the sea. There's this idea of the expansiveness, and for me the idea of hope, which I don't feel necessarily around rivers. I mean, I do if I'm, in full countryside, a really full rushing river, or rapids or anything, something like that that's really exciting, then I have those feelings. But generally with slow city rivers, they make me think of all the things that are really difficult about the city that I live in, or I come from. And so there's this real difference between those kinds of bodies of water for me. And here you have both, so yeah.
Of course, good. Yes.
Mentioned romantic times in your what does that mean to you?
What does lament mean to me? It means an acknowledgement of something that you've experienced that might be sad or painful, traumatic, but there's something about the acknowledgement of what you've been through that demonstrates a sense of knowledge of yourself, and in that there's a kind of resilience and a strength. So for me, lament is nothing weak. It's this understanding of who you are, where you've been, where you might go. It's the kind of that space where you're deciding because you're in it, I think.
Yes.
Hey, thank you very much for this wonderful event, everyone. Thank you so much, Helen, for being here. I'd love to know a bit more about the work you're doing here. If there's more that you can share, perhaps the timeline, when you think will be done, and what will it be?
Basically everything.
The start, the middle, and the end.
Okay. So what I've realised I'm interested in is the relationship between artists, activism and labour. So where, and I'm not done, I'm not finished, and we're kind of working with the archive. So there's the relationship between New Orleans and the civil rights movement across the country. There's talked about Elizabeth Catlett, but also how she then fits in that matrix as well, albeit having moved to live in Mexico. There's the music and sound that's happening now, and that is about me meeting different people, having conversations with different people, and bringing those stories and those voices into the work. There's the idea of landscape, so lots of filming that we've been doing that doesn't show necessarily. I guess I'm probably intentionally avoiding filming in the French Quarter. I'm looking at different things. I'm looking at landscapes that make sense to the conversations that I'm interested in having. Yeah, that's not a very full answer, because I feel a bit like I'm still in it, and so then I don't want to pin it down, but I know that there's a seam that's running through it, which is about art and music, and this idea of craft and making that is almost essential, I would say, in communities, particularly where there's a necessity for activism, agency, and change. Yeah, so that's...
Yes.
That was so interesting what you just said about searching for the landscape sets into the conversations that we want to have, and it just sort of like tied up so much of what I just saw in your work. It's really beautiful. My question is just more of a reflection, like how do those how does that come together for you? Where does that point be? Just you can elaborate a little bit more. And also, why often are you choosing to show like in three?
Well, I think I probably have shown in 3 and in 2 and in 1 probably as much as each. So it's driven really by the material and again around the conversation, the dialogue that I'd like to have. And sometimes it's just about feeling, like the Kessi Bofare film had so much material and there was so much richness that it would have been like a 10-hour film, I think, if I'd made it single screen. So it's a strategy as well. So that's the first bit, that it's kind of driven by where I am, what I'm making, how much I've written, how many interviews I've got, because interviews have become quite significant. I think I started making work where I would be having these conversations where, yes, I would, maybe use some text from James Baldwin, or I would use some Audre Lorde text, and then I would have a conversation with it, and it was very much much more interior work. Anyway, and now I think I pull together stories with other people, so I'll still do that. I still take texts from different places, a sentence or a paragraph, and I somehow put it in dialogue with something I've written or with another piece of text. But now I'm having other people's voices much more forefronted or foregrounded in the films that I make.
They're actual voices, or
Yeah.
your voice?
No, they're actual voices. Yeah. Yeah, so we've just chosen, in fact, these
just happened to be.
Yeah, I mean, Movable Bridge is
has other voices.
Really old. It was like 2017, I think.
Yeah, and there are other parts from Kessi Bofare that have other
has lots of
voices
interviews that either there's voices that are underlay. You don't always know it in my films, but there are usually maybe at least 2 or 3 different layers of audio happening at one time. It's quite subtle, so I'll take some sound from one piece of footage and lay it with another. What was the next bit of the question? I've forgotten. So there was the thing about the different screens. Oh, how do I do it? You know what?
What is sort of drawing you from the image and the voice, and and the flip side, when we hear your voice, I was sort of interested in. You always use your voice to parlay other people's voices, but you just
I think that idea is this idea of the multiple voice coming out, the singular voice, and what that does and what it changes in terms of what's being said. So that is what I'm doing often, and I often don't say whose voice it is. So I'll have some Frantz Fanon text, and it might be really difficult to say, but I'll say it. And I think in the saying of it, you can hear that maybe I haven't written it, or I can hear. I think sometimes people can hear that I haven't written it. But it's this idea that you're thinking about, has she written it? Is that what she's saying? Is that what somebody else has said? And you start to kind of be drawn, I hope, on the wave of these different voices that are still coming out of mine. And then these moments where people are directly in interview, where that that's the person speaking. So I'm trying to kind of have some fluidity, I suppose, across the sound. And the way it develops is my writing. So everything I write isn't necessarily in the film, but that's what drives, I think, the shape of every film and every project. And so many of my screen prints have text on, and they're driven again by my writing, and I might take a piece from a script and have it on a screen print, or I might write something else, and it's all part of the same project, but it's nothing to do with the film. So it's in conversation with it, but it's separate, if that makes sense. So writing probably is I have my notebooks and I write a lot. So
thank you, everyone. We are very fortunate that this is not the last time that Helen will be here in New Orleans with us. Over the coming months, we will be preparing her artist book for publication with our partners Siglio Press and Art and Practice in Los Angeles, our co-publishers. Our exhibition together featuring the work that she's been filming here in New Orleans will first be on view at Art and Practice in spring of 2023, our presenting partner Art and Practice in Los Angeles, before traveling back here to New Orleans. We hope you will follow Amistad and Rivers through our newsletters and social media so that you can see the work that we are doing with Helen and with other artists. And we're so grateful to you for being here tonight. We are going to close the stage time of this evening again with the Young Dex Brass Band. Will lead us into a reception window. And again, thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you.